The sound of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal champagne flute is supposed to signal a celebration. It is a sound that usually precedes a toast to love, to family, to the future. But at my son Trey's rehearsal dinner inside one of Chicago's most expensive steakhouses, that sharp, high-pitched ring signaled the destruction of my 40-year marriage. I sat at the head table, my hands resting calmly in my lap, watching my husband Jerome. He stood up, adjusting his silk tie, the diamond cufflinks I had bought him for our 30th anniversary, catching the warm glow of the chandeliers. To the room full of guests, he looked like the pillar of the community he pretended to be. Pastor Jerome Coleman, a man of God, a man of honor. But as he cleared his throat, I saw the look in his eyes. It was not love. It was adrenaline. He did not look at our son Trey or our beautiful daughter-in-law Sarah. He looked directly at me. Then he reached out his hand. From the table behind us, Chantel stood up. She was 28 years old, wearing a red dress that was entirely too tight for a church function, and she walked toward him with a smile that showed too many teeth. She was his executive assistant. The woman I had invited to Sunday dinners, the woman who was currently resting her hand on her stomach in a gesture that was impossible to misunderstand. Jerome wrapped an arm around her waist and smiled at the room. Friends, family, distinguished guests, he began his voice booming with that practiced preacher cadence. We are here to celebrate love, and in that spirit, I can no longer live a lie. Tonight, I am choosing my own happiness. Odessa and I are finished. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt physical. It sucked the air right out of the room. A waiter in the corner froze a pitcher of water hovering over a glass. Sarah dropped her fork, the metal clattering loudly against her china plate. Trey stood up so fast his chair scraped violently against the floorboards, his fists clenched at his sides. But Jerome kept talking, emboldened by the shock. He looked down at me with a sneer I had never seen before. Chantel here represents the future of the Coleman legacy. She is carrying the new life this family desperately needs. It is time for the old to make way for the new. He waited. I knew exactly what he was waiting for. He wanted me to scream. He wanted me to cry, to flip the table, to cause a scene, so he could look at the congregation later and say, "See, she is unstable. See, I had to leave." He wanted to be the victim of a bitter, crazy old woman. I did not move. My heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, but my face remained as still as stone. I picked up my glass of Merlot, swirled it gently, and took a slow, deliberate sip. The rich, dark wine coated my tongue as I watched Chantel stroke her stomach, looking at me with triumph. They thought I was just a 68-year-old housewife who spent her days arranging flowers and organizing church bake sales. They had forgotten who I was before I retired. They had forgotten that you do not build a life with a man like Jerome Coleman without learning how to survive a storm. My name is Odessa Coleman, and this is how I taught my husband that you should never underestimate the woman who handles the money. Before I continue, please leave a comment telling us where you are watching from and subscribe to the Never Too Old channel. We are creating a community of people who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now back to the story. The silence in the restaurant stretched thin, tight as a wire about to snap. Trey looked ready to leap across the table and strangle his father. I reached out and placed a firm hand on my son's arm. He looked down at me, his eyes wide with panic and rage, but I just gave him a small, almost imperceptible shake of my head. "Sit down, son." I stood up. My knees did not shake. I smoothed the front of my vintage Chanel jacket, picked up my purse, and walked around the table. The heels of my shoes clicked rhythmically on the hardwood floor, the only sound in the room. I walked up to Jerome and Chantel. Up close, I could smell his cologne, a scent I had woken up to for 4 decades mixed with her cheap vanilla perfume. Jerome flinched slightly, bracing himself. He expected a slap. Instead, I reached for the microphone stand he had just used. I pulled the mic off the stand, the feedback whining for a split second, causing a few guests to cover their ears. "Thank you for the heads up, Jerome," I said. My voice was low, steady, amplified through the speakers, so that every person in the back of the room could hear the lack of tremors. It saves me the trouble of bringing it up myself. I reached into my leather handbag. I did not pull out a tissue. I did not pull out a weapon. I pulled out a thick yellow manila envelope. It was heavy, packed tight with documents I had spent the last week compiling. I tossed it onto the table in front of him. It landed with a heavy, satisfying thud, sliding across the white tablecloth until it hit the edge of the wedding cake stand. A gift for the baby. I said, my voice cold enough to freeze the water in the glasses. Open it when you start feeling lonely tonight. I did not wait for a response. I turned my back on them on the gasps that were finally starting to ripple through the crowd, and I walked toward the exit. I kept my head high, my eyes fixed on the exit sign. I could feel their eyes on me, hundreds of them pitying me, judging me, wondering how Odessa Coleman, the dignified matriarch of the community, had let this happen. I pushed through the heavy double doors of the restaurant and stepped out into the cool Chicago night air. The valet saw me coming and scrambled to get my car key. Behind me, the heavy doors began to swing shut on their pneumatic hinges. Just as they were about to close, I heard it. It was not a gasp, it was a scream. A guttural, animalistic roar of pure rage. Jerome. He had opened the envelope. He had seen the divorce papers I had signed 3 days ago, but more importantly, he had seen the copy of the preliminary forensic audit attached to the back. He had seen that I knew about the money. I took the keys from the valet, tipped him a 20, and got into my car. My hands were steady as I adjusted the rearview mirror. I checked my lipstick. Perfect. Then I put the car in gear and drove away, leaving my husband screaming at a ghost. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and rain that had started to fall, slicking the streets of Chicago with a sheen of oil and water. I drove my sensible 10-year-old sedan toward the historic district, toward the red brick mansion that Jerome loved to show off to his parishioners. He told everyone it was the fruit of his labor, a blessing from the Lord for his service. I pulled into the driveway, the wrought iron gates closing behind me with a reassuring clang. The house stood imposing in the dark, valued at nearly $2 million. It was a monument to success. But as I unlocked the heavy oak front door and stepped into the foyer, I didn't feel the warmth of home. I felt the cold draft of a battlefield. I locked the door behind me, engaging the deadbolt. I did not go to the kitchen to make tea. I did not go to the bedroom to cry into my pillow. I walked straight to the library on the ground floor. It was a masculine room, smelling of leather and old paper lined with bookshelves filled with theology books Jerome had never read. I walked to the large oil painting of the two of us that hung above the fireplace. It had been painted 5 years ago. In it, Jerome looked regal, his hand resting possessively on my shoulder. I reached up and swung the heavy frame away from the wall. Behind it was a wall safe. Jerome thought I spent my days gardening. He thought my mind had softened with age, that I was just there to sign checks and look supportive in the front pew. He conveniently forgot that for 30 years I was a forensic auditor for the IRS. My job was not to balance checkbooks. My job was to find the money that billionaires, corporations, and crime syndicates tried to hide. I could look at a spreadsheet and see a lie in 10 seconds. I could trace a shell company through 3 different countries before I finished my morning coffee. I spun the dial. Right to 20, left to 4, right to 19. The tumblers clicked to sound more comforting to me than any prayer. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside the safe was not empty. I had cleared out the jewelry weeks ago. Instead, it was stacked with recording devices, hard drives, and a thick binder labeled The Jerome Project. I had started tracking him 6 months ago, the first time I noticed a discrepancy in the church building fund. Small amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there, amateur work. But then the amounts grew. I took out the binder and set it on the desk. I sat down in Jerome's oversized leather chair, the one he forbade anyone else from using. I turned on the small digital recorder I had retrieved from the safe. I had planted it in his car 2 weeks ago. I listened to his voice, tinny but clear. He was talking to Chantel. "Don't worry, baby. The old hag is clueless. I'll get her to sign over the house deed before the wedding. We'll put her in a home by Christmas. She won't know what hit her." I pressed stop. My hand tightened around the recorder until my knuckles turned white. He didn't just want to leave me. He wanted to erase me. He wanted to take the house my grandmother's money had paid for the reputation I had built and throw me away like a used wrapper. Suddenly my cell phone buzzed on the desk, vibrating against the mahogany wood. The screen lit up with a notification from the bank. It was a priority alert, one I had set up only yesterday. Alert joint checking account, ending in 4490. Status frozen. Available balance, $0,000. I stared at the screen. Jerome moved faster than I thought. He hadn't just announced the divorce. While we were at dinner, while he was making his speech about love and truth, he had logged in and drained our liquid assets. $250,000, our retirement, my security, gone in a single click. He was trying to starve me out. He thought if he cut off the money, I would come crawling back, begging for a settlement, willing to sign anything just to buy groceries. I looked at the zero on the screen. Then I looked at the binder full of evidence on the desk. A cold, hard smile touched my lips. He thought he had made a checkmate. He didn't realize we were playing a completely different game. I picked up my phone and dialed a number. It went to voicemail. Sarah. I said, my voice calm and professional. It's Odessa. The war has started. I need you to bring your laptop. Come to the back door. Do not park in the driveway. I hung up and looked at the empty safe. Jerome wanted a fight. I would give him a war. And I would start by burning his world down $1 at a time. The morning sun was too bright against my windshield as I pulled into the parking lot of the local market. I needed coffee, creamer eggs, and fresh fruit, normal things, to convince myself the world had not actually ended the night before. I walked the aisles mechanically, my mind still replaying the sound of Jerome screaming in the restaurant parking lot. I placed my items on the conveyor belt. The total was $42.15. I slid my Platinum Rewards card, the one we had held jointly for 20 years, into the chip reader. Declined. The red letters flashed on the screen like an accusation. I frowned, thinking perhaps the chip was dirty. I wiped it on my sleeve and inserted it again. The machine beeped a harsh rejecting noise. I am sorry, ma'am, the cashier said, her voice dropping to a whisper so the people in line behind me wouldn't hear. It says the card has been reported stolen. My blood ran cold. Stolen. He was not just leaving me, he was trying to humiliate me in the middle of the produce section. I pulled out my phone to check the banking app. Access denied. The retirement account, the savings, even the emergency fund we kept for house repairs, all of it showed zero or locked. He had moved fast. $250,000 of liquid assets drained overnight. My phone rang in my hand, vibrating against my palm. I looked at the screen. Jerome. I did not answer immediately. First, I tapped the small red icon of the recording app I had installed weeks ago. Then I accepted the call. Hello, Jerome. His voice was thick with satisfaction, the smug tone of a man who thinks he has just won the war. How does it feel, Odessa? I bet you are standing at a register right now looking like a fool. You want to play legal games with envelopes. Go ahead. I hold the purse strings now. I cleared out the accounts this morning. I stood there in the grocery line, my back straight. That is illegal, Jerome. That is marital property. Sue me. He laughed a dry, cruel sound. By the time you get a court date, you will be starving. And listen to me closely. You have 30 days to get out of my house. Chantel does not like the smell of old people. She wants the master suite for the baby nursery. Do not make me call the sheriff to evict you. I did not scream. I did not beg. I simply said, we will see about that, and hung up the phone. I saved the recording immediately. Evidence of financial abuse, evidence of illegal eviction threats. He was handing me ammunition, and he didn't even know it. I looked at the cashier, who was eyeing my groceries with pity, preparing to void the transaction. She thought I was a helpless old woman who had been cut off. She thought I was stranded. I reached into the bottom of my handbag and pulled out an old, unassuming tin that looked like it held mints. I popped the lid. Inside was a thick roll of $100 bills. My grandmother had taught me a long time ago that a woman should always have a freedom fund that no man knows about. I peeled off a bill and handed it to the cashier. Keep the change, I said. I picked up my bags and walked out into the sunlight. Jerome thought he had cut off my air supply. He did not realize I had learned how to breathe underwater a long time ago. My son Trey burst through the front door of the mansion, looking like a man who had been running from a fire. He was usually impeccable, a trait he inherited from me. Not his father, but today his shirt was untucked, and his eyes were wild with a panic I had not seen since he was a little boy, afraid of the dark. The wedding was 5 days away. The house was quiet, still echoing with the threats Jerome had made over the phone, but the silence shattered the moment Trey spoke. "Mom, you have to fix this," he said, his voice cracking. He practically collapsed onto the vintage velvet sofa in the foyer, burying his face in his hands. I sat down beside him, placing a hand on his knee. "What did he do?" "Trey? Tell me. He called me an hour ago," Trey said, looking up. His eyes were red. "He said the wedding checks are going to bounce. The caterer, the venue, the florist. He put a stop payment on everything. He said the trust fund, the money for the down payment on our new house, it is all frozen." My jaw tightened. Jerome knew exactly where to strike. Trey and Sarah were successful. Yes, but they were young. They had just poured every cent of their savings into closing on their first home, relying on the family trust fund money my mother had set aside for this exact purpose to cover the wedding costs. $80,000. Without that money, they would start their marriage in crippling debt. "He gave me an ultimatum," Trey whispered, looking away as if he were ashamed to say the words. "He said the money flows again on one condition. Chantel sits in the front row, in the mother of the groom seat. And you, he wants you in the back, Mom, with the distant relatives, or not there at all." I felt a cold, sharp rage slice through me. It was one thing to hurt me. I could take it. I had armor built from 40 years of dealing with his ego. But to weaponize our son's happiness, to hold a wedding hostage just to humiliate me publicly, that was a new low, even for Jerome Coleman. Trey grabbed my hand, squeezing it desperate hard. "Mom, please. I know it is humiliating. I know it is wrong. But Sarah and we can't cover $80,000 in 5 days. We will lose the venue. We will lose the house deposit. Just let her sit there. It is just one day. Please just swallow your pride for one day so we don't lose everything." I looked at my son. I saw the fear in his eyes, the desperation of a young man about to be crushed by his father's pettiness. He was begging me to let his father's mistress take my place of honor just to save his financial future. A lesser woman might have cried. A weaker woman might have agreed, playing the martyr to save the peace. But I was not a martyr, and I knew something Trey did not. If you give a blackmailer what he wants, he never goes away. He just raises the price. I pulled my hand away gently and stood up, smoothing my skirt. I walked to the window looking out at the driveway where Jerome used to park his luxury sedan. "No, Trey," I said softly. "Mom, please." I turned to face him, my voice hard as steel. "We do not negotiate with terrorists, son, and that is exactly what your father is right now. A financial terrorist. If I give in to this, if I let that woman sit in my seat, he will own you forever. He will hold that trust fund over your head every time he wants something. But the money, Mom, we are ruined." "You are not ruined," I said, walking back to him and gripping his shoulders. "You are a Coleman, but you are my son first. You think your father holds all the cards because he makes the most noise. You forgot who kept the books in this family for 30 years. I leaned in, making sure he saw the fire in my eyes. "Go home to Sarah. Tell her the wedding is on. Tell her nothing changes. I will handle the money. I will handle your father. But I will sit in the front row and I will watch you get married. Jerome thinks he can buy respect. I am going to teach him that some things are not for sale. Now go. I have work to do." Sunday morning at Mount Zion Baptist Church had been my sanctuary for 40 years. It was where I found peace, where I found community, and where I had quietly written the checks that paid for the new roof and the stained glass windows. But as I walked into the sanctuary that morning, wearing my best cream suit and a matching wide-brimmed hat, the air did not feel holy. It felt thick with judgment. I took my usual seat in the front pew, the spot reserved for the First Lady of the church. The ushers looked away as I passed. The choir members stopped whispering and suddenly found their hymnals very interesting. They all knew. In a community this tight news of the rehearsal dinner had traveled faster than the gospel itself. Jerome ascended the pulpit. He looked magnificent in his purple robes, the very image of righteous authority. He gripped the wooden podium, looking out over the congregation, his eyes sweeping past me as if I were invisible. "Brothers and sisters," he boomed, his voice resonating off the rafters. "Today's sermon is about the home. It is about the warmth a man needs to do God's work. Scripture tells us that it is better to live in a corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house. A few scattered amens rippled through the room. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded over my Bible. Jerome was not preaching, he was campaigning. He wiped his brow with a handkerchief. Sometimes a man finds himself in a cold house. He continued, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that leaned into the microphone. A house where there is no support, no love, only judgment and calculation. A man of God needs a helpmeet who brings fire, not ice. He needs a partner who understands his vision, not one who counts the cost. The congregation turned. Hundreds of eyes bored into the back of my neck. I could hear the murmurs. I could feel their pity curdling into disdain. Jerome was painting me as the frigid, bitter anchor dragging down his spiritual ascent, and he was painting himself as the long-suffering victim who had finally found solace. He finished his sermon to thunderous applause. As the organ swelled for the recessional, I stood up to leave. I needed to get to the exit before the crowd blocked me in. I stepped into the center aisle, keeping my head high. Suddenly a body slammed into my shoulder. It was not an accident. I stumbled, barely catching myself on the edge of a pew. I looked up to see Chantel. She was wearing a white dress and a hat that was far too large, clearly trying to play the part of the new First Lady. She didn't apologize. She stepped in close, invading my personal space, smelling of that cloying vanilla perfume. She leaned down, her lips brushing my ear, so only I could hear the venom in her voice. "You are old, Odessa," she whispered. "Just let go. He needs someone young and vibrant to stand beside him when he runs for city council next year. You are just bad optics." She pulled back and smirked, patting her stomach, then turned and walked away, swaying her hips as she went to join Jerome at the door. I straightened my hat. I smoothed my jacket. City council. So that was it. This wasn't just about a midlife crisis or a baby. It was about power. Jerome wanted to be a politician, and he thought trading in his 68-year-old wife for a 28-year-old model would make him look virile and commanding. He thought I was bad optics. He had no idea. As I walked out of the church, ignored by the people I had served for decades, I wasn't feeling shame. I was calculating. If Jerome wanted to run for office, he was going to need a clean financial record. And I was the only one who knew just how dirty his hands really were. The rain had turned from a drizzle to a steady freezing downpour by the time I pulled my sedan up to the wrought iron gates of the mansion. It was Sunday night, the end of the longest day of my life. My bones ached from the tension of sitting in that pew, listening to my husband sermonize about my inadequacies. All I wanted was a hot bath and the silence of my own home. I walked up the front steps, shielding my head with my purse. I slid my key into the heavy oak door, the same key I had carried for 30 years. It stopped halfway. I pushed, jiggled, and tried again. It would not turn. I stepped back, wiping the rain from my glasses. The lock was new. The old tarnished brass deadbolt was gone, replaced by shiny, offensive chrome. He had changed the locks. On a Sunday, in the middle of a storm. I reached for the doorbell, but before I could press it, the sash of the second-story master bedroom window flew open. I looked up. Jerome stood there, framed by the warm golden light of the room that used to be ours. He was wearing his silk smoking jacket, and in his hand he held a glass of my vintage Bordeaux. He looked down at me like a king surveying a peasant at the castle gates. "You didn't listen, Odessa," he shouted over the sound of the rain. "I told you I wanted you out. Possession is 9/10 of the law. Jerome, open this door." I said, my voice calm but loud enough to carry. "This is an illegal lockout." "I don't care about your laws," he bellowed. "You want your things. Here." He disappeared from the window for a second and then reappeared, heaving a massive object over the sill. It was my vintage Louis Vuitton steamer trunk, the one I had bought in Paris 20 years ago. He shoved it out into the void. I watched it fall in slow motion. It tumbled through the wet night air, hitting the manicured lawn with a sickening, wet thud. The latch burst open on impact. My silk blouses, my cashmere sweaters, my personal journals, all spilled out into the mud and the driving rain. Jerome laughed. He actually took a sip of wine and laughed. "Don't come back, Odessa. The alarm code is changed. The police will treat you like a trespasser." He slammed the window shut and drew the heavy velvet curtains. I stood there in the driveway, the rain soaking through my Sunday suit water dripping off the brim of my hat. A normal woman would have picked up a rock and thrown it through that window. A normal woman would have screamed until the neighbors called the cops. I did neither. I walked over to my trunk. I knelt in the mud and began methodically gathering my clothes. My favorite silk blouse was ruined, stained with wet earth. I folded it carefully and placed it back in the trunk. I closed the latch. I pulled out my phone and took a photo of the new lock. I took a photo of the trunk in the mud. I took a photo of the closed window. Then I opened my ride-sharing app and called an Uber. As I waited for the car, I wasn't shivering from the cold. I was shivering from the sheer magnitude of his stupidity. In our state, an illegal lockout of a spouse from the marital residence without a court order is a serious offense. Destruction of personal property is another. Intentional infliction of emotional distress is a third. I ran the numbers in my head as the headlights of the Uber swept across the driveway. The statutory fine for the lockout, the replacement value of the vintage trunk, the damages for the night in the rain. Jerome thought he had thrown me out like garbage. He didn't realize that by throwing that trunk, he had just handed me a $50,000 check. I got into the back of the stranger's car, muddy and wet, and gave the driver my son's address. Let Jerome enjoy his wine tonight. He was going to pay for every single drop. Trey opened the door of his downtown loft, his face crumpling the moment he saw me. I was standing in the hallway, shivering uncontrollably, my Sunday best ruined by mud and rain, my vintage Louis Vuitton trunk dripping onto his welcome mat. He reached for me, his hands shaking. "Mom, oh my God, he did this to you. He threw you out in the storm." I stepped inside the warmth of the apartment, hitting me like a physical weight. "I am fine, Trey," I said, though my teeth were chattering. "Do not let him see you bleed, son. That is what he wants." But before Trey could launch into a tirade against his father or run to get blankets, Sarah stepped forward. My daughter-in-law was a small woman, pale and quiet, with glasses that constantly slid down her nose. Most people at church thought she was just a shy girl who worked with computers. They had no idea she was a senior cybersecurity analyst for a defense contractor. Sarah did not offer me tea. She did not ask if I was okay. She looked at my eyes, saw the cold fire burning there, and nodded once. "Trey, get your mother some dry clothes," she said, her voice sharp and authoritative. "Mom Odessa, come with me. We need to go to the server room." She led me past the living room into the second bedroom, which they had converted into a home office. It looked like the cockpit of a spaceship. 3 curved monitors glowed with streams of code and grainy video feeds. Server racks hummed in the corner, cooling fans whirring a steady rhythm. Sarah pulled out a chair for me. She took a deep breath, her hands hovering over her mechanical keyboard. "Mom Odessa, I need to apologize. I crossed a line 2 weeks ago. I noticed some weird traffic on your home network, so I backdoored your security system. I hacked your cameras. I looked at the screens. There on the center monitor was a live feed of my driveway. I saw Jerome's silhouette in the master bedroom window still drinking his wine." "You hacked my house?" I asked, my voice neutral. "Yes," she said. "And I saw everything. I saw him bring Chantel over while you were at Bible study. I saw him bring a man in a cheap suit yesterday morning. An appraiser, Mom, he is trying to get a valuation on the house behind your back." I leaned forward, staring at the digital evidence of my husband's betrayal. He was moving faster than I thought. He was not just trying to kick me out, he was trying to leverage the equity before the divorce papers were filed. Sarah looked at me terrified I would be angry at the invasion of privacy. Instead, I reached into my sodden purse. I pulled out the waterproof flash drive I had kept on my keychain for 20 years, a habit from my days at the IRS. I placed the drive on her desk next to her high-tech equipment. "You have the eyes, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "But I have the numbers. On that drive is every bank statement, every credit card transaction, and every shell company transfer Jerome has made in the last 5 years. I tracked the money, but I could not crack his encrypted cloud backups to find the communications." Sarah picked up the drive, turning it over in her fingers. Her eyes lit up not with pity, but with professional excitement. The shy daughter-in-law vanished, replaced by a digital predator. "You want me to find the messages?" she asked. "I want you to find everything I replied. I want his emails, his texts, his deleted search history. I want to know who he is talking to and how he plans to hide the money." Sarah plugged the drive into her tower. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bringing up terminal windows that scrolled green text faster than I could read. "I handle the digital footprint," she said, her reflection grim in the monitor. "You handle the financial trail." I nodded, feeling the first real warmth I had felt all night. Jerome thought he was fighting a lonely old woman and her soft son. He had no idea he had just declared war on a forensic accountant and a master hacker. We were not just going to divorce him, we were going to dismantle him. The digital clock on the server rack read 3:14 in the morning. My eyes felt like they were filled with sand, but my mind was razor sharp, fueled by adrenaline and the cold brew coffee Sarah had pressed into my hand. The room was dark, save for the blue glow of the monitors which cast long shadows across our faces. Sarah had been attacking Jerome's encrypted cloud account for 4 hours. She was typing with a rhythm that sounded like heavy rain on a tin roof. Suddenly the typing stopped. Sarah sat back in her ergonomic chair and let out a short, humorless laugh. "Got him," she whispered. I leaned forward, adjusting my glasses. "You cracked the encryption. It was barely encryption, Mom Odessa." She pointed at the screen. "You want to know what his master password was?" Prophet 1, with a capital P and the number 1. The arrogance of the man. He really thought he was the chosen one, even in cyberspace. Sarah hit the enter key, and the screen flooded with folders. It was his entire digital life laid bare. Bank statements, tax returns, hidden spreadsheets, and investment portfolios. I took the mouse, my hand steady. This was my domain now. I opened the main financial summary, expecting to see the wealth he liked to brag about at dinner parties. I expected to see the millions he claimed to have made from wise investments. Instead, I saw a financial graveyard. Jerome was not rich. He was insolvent. His personal accounts were overdrawn. His credit cards were maxed out. So how was he paying for the country club membership and the leased luxury cars? I started cross-referencing his deposits with the church ledgers I had saved on my flash drive. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the pattern. It was the Community Center Building Fund. For 5 years, the congregation had been donating to build a safe place for at-risk youth. Widows had given their pension checks. Children had given their allowance. The fund should have had over $2 million in it. I pulled up the expense reports. There were recurring outgoing wire transfers labeled as architectural consulting fees. $10,000 here, $20,000 there. It was a slow, steady bleed that had hemorrhaged $1.2 million over 3 years. "Sarah, run a background check on this vendor," I said, pointing to a company listed as C&J Consulting Group. Sarah's fingers flew across the keys. 2 minutes later, a registration document popped up. "Registered agent is Marcus Williams," Sarah read. "Address is an apartment complex in South Chicago." I felt a wave of nausea that had nothing to do with the late hour. Marcus Williams. That is Chantel's cousin. He is a personal trainer, not an architect. The picture was complete, and it was uglier than I could have imagined. Jerome was laundering the church's money through a shell company set up in his mistress's family name. He was stealing from orphans and at-risk kids to fund Chantel's designer wardrobe and his own ego. He wasn't just a bad husband. He was a predator. I looked at the total amount stolen. $1.2 million. This was not a civil matter anymore. This was federal embezzlement. I had enough right here to put him away for a decade. But as I clicked on the next folder labeled Property Management, the blood drained from my face. The church money was gone, but that wasn't the only thing he had stolen. Sarah clicked on the folder labeled House, and a cascade of PDF documents filled the center screen. My eyes scanned the file names, and for a moment my heart simply forgot to beat. These were not property tax records or insurance policies. They were loan agreements. "Open that one," I said, pointing to a document dated 18 months ago. Sarah double-clicked. It was a deed of trust for a second mortgage on our home. I leaned in closer until my nose almost touched the monitor. There at the bottom of the page was a signature, Odessa Coleman. It looked like my handwriting. The loop of the O was perfect. The sharp slant of the C was precise. To a bank teller or a notary, it would look authentic. But I was a forensic auditor, and I knew my own hand. The pressure was too heavy on the downstrokes. The spacing was a fraction of a millimeter too wide. It was a forgery, a high-quality practiced forgery, but a fake nonetheless. He signed my name. I whispered, the rage turning into a cold, hard knot in my stomach. He mortgaged the house without my knowledge. "Keep scrolling, Mom." "Odessa." Sarah said, her voice tight. "There is more. There was a third mortgage taken out just 6 months ago from a high-risk private lender." I did the math in my head as Sarah opened the files. $300,000 for the first one, $500,000 for the second. He had stripped the equity. My grandmother's legacy, the home that was supposed to be our retirement security, was gone. He had drained $800,000 out of the walls and the foundation. Where did it go, I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Sarah pulled up a spreadsheet. Cryptocurrency trading platforms, luxury car leases, a down payment on a condo in the city center. He has been living like a king on borrowed time. Then Sarah opened a subfolder labeled Scanned Mail. It was full of letters he must have intercepted from the mailbox before I got home. Notice of default, intent to foreclose, acceleration warning. The house was not just mortgaged, it was in active foreclosure. The bank was weeks away from seizing the property. Suddenly, the entire divorce strategy made sickening sense. Jerome wasn't just trying to leave me for a younger woman. He was setting a trap. He was going to offer me the house in the divorce settlement. He was going to stand in front of a judge and act like the magnanimous husband, giving his poor wife the family mansion while he walked away with nothing. He wanted to give me the house because he knew it was a ticking time bomb. He wanted to transfer the title to me so that when the bank came to repossess it, the debt would be my problem. He planned to be long gone, living in his new condo with Chantel, while the sheriff was throwing my furniture out onto the lawn. He was not just a thief. He was an arsonist. He had set fire to our life and was planning to lock me inside the burning building while he escaped out the back door. I looked at the foreclosure notice on the screen. The date for the sheriff's sale was set for next month. He had timed it perfectly to coincide with the wedding. Sarah looked up at me, her face pale in the monitor glow. "Mom, Odessa, he owes almost $1 million. If you take the house, you take the debt." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the driveway where he had thrown my trunk just hours before. He thought he was playing chess. He thought he was sacrificing a queen to save his king. Print it all. "Sarah," I said, my voice devoid of any emotion, "print every single page. He wants me to have the house. I am going to let him think he won. I am going to let him sign that settlement agreement, because he forgot to read the fine print on the deed. He forgot who actually owns this land. And when the bank comes for their money, they are not going to find me. They are going to find him." Sarah reached for the landline, her hand hovering over the receiver, ready to dial 911. She was trembling, the shock of the mortgage fraud turning into the righteous anger of a woman protecting her family. "No police, Sarah," I said, my voice cutting through the hum of the server fans. "Put the phone down." "But Mom, Odessa, he forged your signature," she argued, her eyes wide. "That is a felony. The police will arrest him tonight." I shook my head slowly. "You are thinking like a civilian." "Sarah, Jerome plays golf with the chief of police every Tuesday morning. He baptized the sheriff's daughter last spring. If we call the local precinct, they will call him first. They will give him a heads up. He will have time to shred documents, wipe hard drives, and hide the money. We will lose the element of surprise." I sat down at her desk and pulled a fresh PDF form onto the main screen. It was a document I had memorized line by line during my 30 years of service. Form 211, Application for Award for Original Information. "We are not going to the police," I said, my eyes fixed on the screen. "We are going to the people Jerome actually fears. We are going to the Criminal Investigation Division of the IRS." Sarah watched as I began to fill in the fields. I did not need to look up Jerome's Social Security number or the tax ID numbers for his shell companies. I knew them by heart. I typed in the details of the unreported income. I listed the illegal wire transfers from the church fund disguised as business expenses. I itemized the capital gains he had hidden in offshore crypto wallets. "I am giving them everything, Sarah, not just the mortgage fraud. the tax evasion, the money laundering, the embezzlement. This is a federal case now. I clicked the button to attach the evidence files Sarah had harvested. The bank statements showing the flow of funds to Chantel's cousin, the forged loan documents, the email threads where he bragged about hiding assets. It was a roadmap to his destruction. Sarah looked at the form, her face pale. "Mom, Odessa, if you send this..." "He is not just getting fined. He is going to federal prison. For a long time." "I know," I said. "And you..." She hesitated. "You filed joint returns with him. Won't you get in trouble too?" I smiled a thin, humorless expression. That is the beauty of the whistleblower program. Under the innocent spouse relief rule, because I am the one reporting the crime and proving I had no knowledge of the illegal activities, I am immune from prosecution. And there is one more thing. I pointed to the section at the bottom of the form regarding the award percentage. Because the amount in dispute exceeds $2 million, the whistleblower is entitled to between 15% and 30% of whatever the government recovers. I am not just sending him to jail, Sarah. I am going to get paid to do it. I picked up the digital stylus. My hand hovered over the signature line for a fraction of a second. I thought about the man I married 40 years ago. I thought about the boy who used to bring me flowers. Then I thought about the man who threw my trunk into the mud and tried to leave me homeless. I pressed the stylus to the screen and signed my name. Odessa Coleman. The strokes were firm and dark. I hit submit. The screen flashed a confirmation number. It was done. The clock was ticking, and Jerome didn't even know the bomb was already under his chair. Sarah stopped typing abruptly, her fingers hovering over the mechanical keys as if they had just touched something burning hot. She did not look at me immediately. Instead, she stared at the secondary monitor, her expression shifting from professional focus to pure, unadulterated disgust. "Mom, Odessa, you need to see this," she said, her voice low. I recovered Chantel's deleted search history and her Amazon archive. She pulled up a digital receipt dated 3 weeks ago. It was not for prenatal vitamins. It was not for a crib. It was an order from a novelty gag gift website. Item number 442, realistic prank pregnancy test, always positive, price $12.99. I stared at the screen, feeling bile rise in my throat. There was no baby. There was no air. It was all a prop, a cheap plastic tool used to rush the timeline to force me out of the house before I could ask too many questions. Jerome had blown up our family for a lie that cost less than a lunch salad. "But that is not the worst part," Sarah said, and this time her voice trembled. I got into Jerome's draft folder, the emails he has not sent yet but is preparing. She clicked a file. It was an application for a term life insurance policy. The insured was Odessa Coleman. The beneficiary was Jerome Coleman. The coverage amount was $2 million. The date on the application was from yesterday. He was trying to rush it through a high-risk broker who asked fewer questions. I felt a chill that went deeper than the damp clothes I was wearing. The foreclosure was looming. The loan sharks were circling. A divorce settlement would take months, maybe years to pay out. But a life insurance payout. That was fast. That was clean. He did not just want to divorce me. He did not just want to steal the house. He was betting on me not surviving the stress. Or worse, he was planning to ensure I didn't. He wanted me to disappear permanently so he could use my death to pay for his new life. I looked at the screen, seeing the man I had shared a bed with for 40 years transform into a stranger capable of the unthinkable. He needed $2 million to clear his debts, and he had decided my life was the price of admission. I looked at Sarah. My hands were no longer shaking. Fear had burned away, leaving only a cold, terrifying clarity. "He thinks I am the victim," I whispered. "He has no idea he is the one in danger." Jerome picked up the heavy, expensive pen from the mahogany conference table with a flourish that was entirely unnecessary. He did not just sign the document, he attacked it. The scratch of the nib against the thick legal paper sounded loud in the quiet room, a rhythm of arrogance that echoed off the paneled walls. He was smiling, that wide, charming smile he usually reserved for Sunday sermons after the collection plate had been passed. To him, this was the final victory lap. He was stripping me of the mansion. He was taking the consulting firm, which he believed was a gold mine. And he was casting me aside with nothing but a 20-year-old car and a trust fund he considered worthless. "You made the right choice, Odessa," he said without looking up from the pages. He flipped through them rapidly, barely glancing at the text. A man of his stature does not read the details. He hires people for that. But his lawyer Franklin was too busy counting his billable hours to notice the trap I had laid. Jerome paused on page 12. For a second my heart hammered against my ribs. Had he seen it? Had he noticed the language was different? But he was just checking the property description, making sure the address of the mansion was correct. He wanted to be absolutely certain he owned every brick and beam. He signed his name with a sweeping underline, Jerome Coleman. He looked up at me, his eyes dancing with triumph. "There, it is done. The house is mine. The company is mine, and you are free to go live your quiet little life." He had no idea what he had just done. He had been so focused on acquiring the assets that he had completely ignored the liabilities. I had insisted on the insertion of a standard but very specific clause on page 14, paragraph 3, the assumption of liability. It stated in dense, boring legal language that the party receiving the assets assumes full and total personal legal responsibility for all debts, liens, encumbrances, and tax obligations related to said assets, whether known or unknown from the date of acquisition, retroactively to the date of original purchase. By signing that paper, Jerome had not just taken the house. He had personally assumed the $800,000 in high-interest mortgage debt he had tried to hide. He had not just taken the company. He had legally accepted full responsibility for the $1.2 million in laundered money and the tax evasion associated with it. He had just voluntarily signed a confession and a promissory note to the federal government. He handed the papers to Franklin, who stamped them with his notary seal. The sound was like a gavel coming down on a death sentence. "Pleasure doing business with you, Odessa," Jerome said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "Try not to be too late moving your boxes out. Chantel wants to start painting the nursery on Tuesday." I stood up slowly, clutching my purse. I did not smile. I did not frown. I just looked at him with the flat, clinical detachment of an auditor looking at a bankrupt ledger. "Enjoy the wedding, Jerome," I said softly. "It will be a day to remember." He laughed, waving a dismissive hand as he turned to leave the room. "Oh, I intend to." I walked out of the office and into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, cutting off his laughter, I finally allowed myself to exhale. He thought he had signed a victory treaty. He had actually signed a suicide note. Now all I had to do was wait for the ink to dry. Saturday morning arrived with a sky so blue it felt like a mockery of the storm brewing on the ground. The wedding venue was a historic estate on the North Shore, the kind of place that charged $500 just to breathe the air. I watched from the back seat of my Uber as a white stretch limousine pulled up to the grand entrance. It was ostentatious. It was loud. It was exactly Jerome. The driver opened the door and Jerome stepped out. He was wearing a custom tuxedo that cost more than my first car. He turned and offered his hand to Chantel. She emerged wearing a dress that was more appropriate for a nightclub than a morning wedding covered in jewelry that caught the sunlight and fractured it into 1,000 blinding sparks. I recognized the diamond necklace. I recognized the ruby bracelet. I had seen the wire transfers that paid for them. That wasn't jewelry. That was the roof of the community center. That was the scholarship fund for the youth choir. She was wearing felony evidence around her neck and smiling like she had won the lottery. My Uber driver pulled up behind the limo. I thanked him and stepped out onto the gravel drive. I was not wearing diamonds. I was wearing a navy blue silk dress that I had owned for 10 years. It was tailored to perfection, modest and elegant, the uniform of a woman who does not need to shout to be heard. I held a small beaded clutch in my hand. To anyone watching, it looked like it held a compact and some tissues. They did not know it held a high-capacity USB drive and a wireless lavalier microphone. It was the heaviest thing I had ever carried. I walked toward the massive oak doors. Jerome saw me coming. He excused himself from a conversation with a state senator and moved quickly to intercept me. He blocked the doorway. His body tense, a fake smile plastered on his face for the benefit of the photographers, but his eyes were hard as flint. He leaned in close, his voice a low hiss. "You actually showed up. I thought you would have the decency to stay home and pack." I almost laughed. He still thought he was the one giving orders. "Listen to me, Odessa," he whispered aggressively. "There are senators here. There are investors. Do not do anything stupid. Do not make a scene. If you embarrass me today, I will make sure you lose that trust fund too. I will leave you with absolutely nothing." I looked at him. I looked at the sweat beading on his upper lip despite the cool breeze. He was terrified. He knew he was standing on a house of cards, but he thought he could hold it together with threats and hairspray. I smiled. It was a genuine smile, the kind you give to a child who doesn't understand the stove is hot. "You just worry about your part, Jerome," I said softly, stepping around him. "I will take care of mine." I walked past him into the cool, dim interior of the hall. He stared after me, confused by my calm, unsettling assurance. He should have been worried. He was worried about losing face. He should have been worried about losing his freedom. The reception hall was a masterpiece of deception. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen tears, and thousands of white lilies filled the air with a scent so thick it was almost suffocating. 300 guests sat at round tables draped in heavy satin. There were state senators, local council members, and the wealthy elite of Chicago's South Side. They were eating filet mignon and drinking vintage champagne, unaware that they were actually attending an execution. I sat at the mother of the groom table, but not in the seat of honor. Jerome had ensured that Chantel was seated closest to the center aisle. She was beaming, waving to people she didn't know, acting for all the world like she was the matriarch of this family. I sat quietly next to Sarah, my hands folded on my lap, my small beaded clutch resting innocently against my leg. Then the moment arrived. Jerome stood up. He walked to the center of the stage where the band had just finished a jazz set. He took the microphone with the ease of a man who had spent 40 years preaching to captive audiences. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket and smiled that million-dollar smile. Distinguished guests, family and friends, his voice boomed rich and commanding. "We are gathered here to celebrate the union of my son Trey and his lovely bride Sarah. But as I look out at this room, I am reminded that marriage is more than just a contract. It is a covenant. It is the bedrock of our society." He paused for effect, letting the words sink in. The hypocrisy was so thick I could taste it like bile. Here was a man who had forged my signature stolen from orphans and tried to defraud an insurance company, lecturing a room full of people about the sanctity of covenants. Family is built on truth. He continued, his voice dropping to a somber, earnest register. And sometimes truth requires difficult choices. Sometimes truth requires us to step out of the shadows of the past and into the light of the future. He turned and extended a hand toward Chantel. She stood up, preening under the spotlight. "I want to introduce you all to my future," Jerome announced, his voice swelling with pride. "This is Chantel. She is the new light of my life. She has brought a vitality and a honesty to my world that I have been missing for a very long time. She is the mother of the new generation of Colemans." A ripple of uneasy murmurs went through the room. It was one thing to have a mistress. It was another thing entirely to parade her around at your son's wedding while your wife of 40 years sat 10 feet away. Trey grabbed the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. He started to rise, his face contorted with a mix of shame and fury. He was about to storm the stage. He was about to do something that would get him arrested or thrown out. I reached out and placed my hand over his. His skin was cold and clammy. I squeezed hard, grounding him. "Not yet," I whispered. "Wait." I looked past him to Sarah. She was sitting with her laptop open on her knees, hidden by the tablecloth. She wasn't looking at Jerome. She was looking at me. Her finger was hovering over the enter key. She gave me a single, sharp nod. It was time. Jerome had built his stage. He had gathered his audience. He had preached his sermon on truth. Now I was going to help him live up to it. I picked up my clutch and stood up. I did not run to the stage. I did not rush. I walked with the slow, terrifying momentum of a glacier that was about to reshape a landscape. The sound of my heels on the hardwood floor was the only thing audible over the sudden, confused murmuring of the crowd. Jerome saw me coming, and his confident politician mask cracked. He took a step back, nearly tripping over the monitor wedge, his eyes darting frantically to the side of the room where the venue security stood. "Get her out of here," he hissed, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Someone remove her. She is disturbing the peace." Two large men in black suits stepped forward, moving to intercept me before I could reach the stairs. But they never made it. Trey moved faster. My son, who had spent his entire life trying to please his father, trying to be the peacemaker, finally chose a side. He stepped into the aisle, blocking the path of the guards. He did not raise his voice, but he squared his shoulders, looking every bit the man I had raised him to be. "Do not touch my mother," Trey said, his voice low and dangerous. "If you take one more step toward her, this wedding turns into a riot. Back off." The guards hesitated. They looked at Jerome, then at the furious groom, and they stopped. That was all the time I needed. I ascended the stairs and walked right up to my husband. He clutched the microphone like a lifeline, but his knuckles were white. I reached out and took the microphone from his hand. He was so shocked, so paralyzed by the sudden shift in power, that he let it go without a fight. I turned to face the room. I saw the confused faces of the senators, the church elders, the people who had respected the name Coleman for decades. "You are right, Jerome," I said, my voice calm and conversational, as if we were discussing the weather and not the end of his life. "You said family is built on truth. You said truth is the foundation. I agree completely. And since you are so committed to the truth, I have one final wedding gift for you, a gift of total transparency." I looked down at the table where Sarah sat. She was ready. I gave her a small nod. Sarah hit the enter key on her laptop. Behind us, the massive projection screen, which was supposed to be displaying a montage of Trey and Sarah's childhood photos, flickered to life. But there were no baby pictures. There were no smiling faces. Instead, a high-resolution image of a bank statement filled the 20-foot screen. It was magnified so clearly that even the people in the back row could read the numbers. The room went deadly silent. At the top of the document it read, "Mount Zion Community Center Building Fund." Highlighted in neon yellow was a wire transfer for $50,000. The line traced down to a receiving account labeled C&J Consulting Group. And then a third line connected that consulting group to a final destination: Gold Coast Bentley Dealership. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room. It sounded like a physical blow. I turned back to the screen and pointed. "That is not just a spreadsheet," I said into the microphone. "That is the roof money for the orphanage. That is the scholarship fund for the choir. And as you can see, it did not go to an architect. It went to a shell company, registered to Chantel's cousin, and then it went to pay for the car that is currently parked out front with a just married sign on it." I looked at the senator in the front row. He had put on his glasses and was staring at the screen with his mouth open. I looked at the church deacon, who had turned a shade of gray I had never seen before. Jerome tried to grab the microphone back, lunging at me. "That is a lie," he screamed, his voice cracking. "That is fake." She doctored it, but Sarah was already hitting the next key. The screen changed. Now it showed credit card statements. Hotel bills for suites in Paris and Milan booked under the church's expense account, with Chantel listed as the companion. The crowd was not murmuring anymore. They were standing up. Chairs scraped against the floor. A woman screamed. The illusion of the pious, perfect Pastor Coleman shattered into a million jagged pieces right there on the stage. He looked at the screen, then at the crowd, and for the first time in 40 years, he had absolutely nothing to say. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom did not just open. They were thrown wide with a force that rattled the hinges, the sound cracking through the room like a thunderclap. The crowd turned as one, expecting perhaps another theatrical surprise, maybe a cake or a musical guest. What they saw instead made the blood drain from the faces of the politicians in the front row. 6 men and women strode into the room. They were not wearing tuxedos. They were not wearing evening gowns. They were wearing navy blue windbreakers with bold yellow lettering across the back that read, IRS Criminal Investigation. They moved with the terrifying synchronized purpose of a pack of wolves closing in on a wounded deer. They did not look at the guests. They did not look at the decorations. Their eyes were locked on one target. They marched straight up the center aisle, their heavy boots thudding against the hardwood floor. The music had stopped. The murmuring had died. The only sound was the heavy rhythmic approach of federal justice. They ascended the stairs to the stage. Jerome stood frozen, the microphone still dangling from his hand, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from the water. He looked at them, then he looked at me, and for the first time I saw the realization hit him. This was not a prank. This was the end. Jerome Coleman, the lead agent, barked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. You are under arrest for 12 counts of tax evasion, wire fraud, money laundering, and bank fraud. 2 agents moved in, grabbing Jerome by the arms. He tried to pull away, his dignity crumbling into panic. You cannot do this! Jerome screamed, spit flying from his lips as they spun him around and slapped the handcuffs on his wrists. The metal clicked shut, a sound of finality that echoed through the silent hall. Do you know who I am? I am a pillar of this community. I have assets. He thrashed against the agents, his eyes wild, looking for anyone who could save him. He looked at the senator, who was currently looking at the ceiling. He looked at the deacons, who were looking at their shoes. I have money, Jerome yelled, his voice cracking with desperation. I can pay whatever fine you want. I have a $2 million estate. I own the mansion on the hill. I have equity. I stepped forward one last time. I leaned into the microphone, my voice soft, almost intimate, like I was telling him a secret, but amplified so every soul in that room could hear the trap snap shut. No, Jerome, I said. You don't. He froze, twisting his neck to look at me, the handcuffs digging into his skin. I looked him dead in the eye. You signed those post-nuptial papers yesterday, Jerome. You were so eager to take everything you didn't read the fine print. You signed a document accepting full personal liability for all debts and encumbrances attached to the property. You assumed the $800,000 fraudulent mortgage you took out. You assumed the tax liens. I paused, letting a small, cold smile touch my lips. But the house itself, the deed that belongs to the irrevocable family trust my grandmother established 50 years ago, it never belonged to us. It never transferred to you. You didn't sign for the asset, Jerome. You only signed for the debt. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. He slumped in the agent's grip, his legs giving out as the math finally added up in his head. He was going to prison, and he was going there owing nearly $1 million on a house he couldn't even sell. Thank you for paying off my mortgage, Jerome, I whispered. It was very generous of you. Jerome's screams faded into the night air as the agents dragged him out through the heavy double doors of the ballroom. It was a chaotic, undignified exit for a man who had spent his entire life preening for an audience, but he was not the only one leaving in handcuffs. As the lead agent secured Jerome in the back of a vehicle, another team approached the head table where Chantel sat frozen in her tight red dress. She tried to snatch her designer handbag, the one purchased with stolen church funds, but an agent intercepted it. They didn't just find the keys to the leased luxury car inside. They found the receipt for the prank pregnancy test and a small notebook where she had foolishly tracked her share of the laundered money. She was not just a mistress, she was a co-conspirator. As they led her away, the illusion of the Coleman air vanished along with her freedom. On the stage, the heavy silence finally broke. Trey rushed forward and wrapped his arms around me, holding me tighter than he had since he was a frightened child. Sarah joined us a moment later, tears streaming down her face, not of sadness, but of sheer, overwhelming relief. We stood there, the three of us, a united front against the wreckage, while the room erupted into applause. It was not the wedding reception anyone had planned, but as the band struck up a lively jazz number and the waiters began pouring fresh champagne, the atmosphere shifted. The heavy fog of Jerome's judgment evaporated. We were not mourning a marriage, we were celebrating a liberation. We danced until midnight, not because we were happy about the destruction, but because we had survived the fire without being burned. 6 months later, I sat on the veranda of my red brick mansion, watching the leaves turn gold in the autumn sun. The justice system moves slowly for some, but when you hand the IRS a roadmap to millions in stolen tax revenue, they move with remarkable speed. Jerome pled guilty to all charges to avoid a public trial that would have aired every remaining dirty secret he had. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. He will be 85 years old when he breathes free air again, assuming he lasts that long without his silk sheets and vintage wine. Yesterday, a plain white envelope arrived in my mailbox from the Department of the Treasury. Inside was a check for $300,000, my whistleblower award for helping the government recover the stolen funds. I did not buy jewelry. I did not buy a cruise. I called Trey and Sarah and told them to come over. I used the money to buy out the remaining shares of the consulting firm from the government seizure auction, rebranding it and handing full legal control to my son. He would build it back the right way with integrity and hard work. I took a sip of my iced tea, feeling the cool breeze on my face. Jerome had stood in that restaurant and told the world he wanted a new ending. He wanted a fresh start. Well, I gave him exactly what he asked for. I gave him an ending behind bars. I am Odessa Coleman, and I never got old. I just got sharper. The most profound lesson from Odessa's journey is the fatal danger of underestimation. Jerome looked at his wife of 40 years and saw only a relic to be discarded, mistaking her silence for weakness and her patience for submission. He forgot that the woman standing beside him was not merely a background character in his life, but a highly skilled professional with a history of taking down entities far more powerful than him. This story serves as a powerful reminder that true strength often moves in silence. While Jerome relied on loud proclamations and public spectacles, Odessa utilized preparation documentation and the law to secure her future. Furthermore, the narrative underscores the absolute necessity of financial literacy. Odessa's victory was not born from simple vengeance, but from her ability to follow the money and understand the fine print that her husband arrogantly ignored. In a world that often tries to render older women invisible, Odessa teaches us that knowledge is the ultimate weapon. When faced with betrayal, the most effective response is not emotional outbursts, but strategic action. We learn that dignity is not something you beg for. It is something you command by knowing your worth and enforcing the consequences for those who try to devalue it. If you believe that wisdom and integrity are the true measures of power, hit that subscribe button and share this story with someone who needs a reminder of their own inner strength.